Will you let me share?
Yep, now you can share.
Cool.
Perfect. Now you go full screen.
I will go full screen. Let's play. Hey, there we go.
All right, guys. So welcome back to another installment of the philosophy seminar here at UQ. And our speaker today is Dr. Eldricht from Simon Fraser University in Canada. And Eldricht is going to be talking about musement and radical thought. So please, Eldricht, take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Guillermo and Greg, for having me and helping me set this up. I'm here accompanying my son as well, who's part of the national roller derby, junior roller derby team for Canada, and the World Cup is being held right now. Right? It actually starts tonight over the weekend, so this is kind of what brought us here, and I thought I'd look up Greg. Greg was very kind enough to write my first review of my first book, 2013, I think, something like a long time ago. So I'd never met Greg before, but we've got in touch. So again, thank you for helping me organize this. So this talk, as we so often say, right, is part of a larger project, a larger study, and it's one that comes out of my research on aesthetics and the logics of daydreaming and mind wandering. Right. So for now, though, I'm not going to talk directly about these things. Instead, I don't have an aesthetic object, and I don't purport to develop a complete theory of daydreaming in this work that that's in progress here. I do want to take this time, though, however, to talk about it's something that is its own aesthetic event, one that folds into its form a manner of thinking, about thinking, that shows the value of what's called spontaneous thought, to rest in its singular and radical way of putting itself under suspicion. So with that, I'm going to see if I can get this to begin. There we go. It's going to be a little bit jerky because of the delay, but it actually works well with the the aesthetic that I'm talking about here. So okay, so to begin, so of all the fascinating things going on today in the study of spontaneous and maybe even artificial thought, it's with a certain embarrassment that I find myself about to deliver a talk on something so outmoded as the thought of Charles Sanders Peirce, right? Yes, that crank and gifted logician who proclaimed himself a dandy and a peer of Leibniz. It's not, however, that said crank doesn't have something to say about the nature of thought and its spontaneous modes. Indeed, his take on the subject is highly idiosyncratic, but nevertheless meaningful. For Peirce sees in human thought a method for thinking about novelty that gives it purchase in both aesthetic and epistemological pursuits. All right, so why my chagrin? Well, given the recent spate of empirically grounded theories that populate the study of daydreaming, mind wandering, rumination, etc., my attention to an introspectively garnered insight will be terribly unfashionable. However, as Oscar Wilde put it, and this is a quote, "Fashion is a form of ugliness so intolerable that we have to alter it every 6 months." Right? And so I'm inclined here to see this hype about any theory as an alibi for its natural grotesquerie. So that said, let's accept this monstrosity for what it is and see about putting some clothes on it, if only of an emperor's kind. Okay. So near the end of his life, Peirce composed an essay that made daydreaming a central method for his brand of logical inference that he called abduction. So unlike induction or deduction, which concern the assessment of hypotheses, abduction refers to all the operations by which theories and conceptions are engendered. And while we make abductions all the time, for Peirce, there is a particular state in which abduction comes most readily. This state, he says, involves no purpose save that of casting aside all serious purpose. And while this condition requires a lively exercise of one's powers, it is nonetheless agreeable and refreshing enough more than to repay the expenditure. So he at one point considered calling this state reverie. However, he suggests such a designation would be too excruciating a misfit. Reverie would be too likely to characterize an asinine drifting hither and yon, and it would be antithetical to the way in which the thinking he has in mind lends itself to a degree of self-control. What he ultimately calls musement describes then a type of thinking that is more like play, a form of pure play, in that it follows no law, but, as he says, the law of liberty. So in other words, musement takes no single form. It may be conducted as aesthetic contemplation, or castle building, or generally noticing, wondering, and speculating about stuff. But perhaps most importantly is that musement is not merely playful, but purposeless. It might come to derive a purpose, such as wondering is wont to do, but its doing need not be spurred by any particular goal or mission set before it, aside, that is, from, as he says again, casting aside all serious purpose. So this means that not only are musement's methods sundry and its subject matter eclectic, but meaning, truth, and error are suspended, for musement as such doesn't have any particular aim. Now, Peirce did not present the idea of musement for the sake of itself. And he didn't just pull it out of a hat fully formed. In fact, this notion of pure play is something he purloined, let's say, from the German aesthetician Friedrich Schiller. And he who argued that human beings are generally oriented by two forces, which he names the sense drive and the form drive. So the former, the sense drive, concerns sensuous engagement with the outer world, whereas the latter, form drive, involves its agents in bringing order to that world. However, under certain circumstances, the aesthetic experience of beauty, to be specific, these drives can harmonize and give rise to what Schiller calls a third play drive, or rather a play effect that manifests as the experience of existential freedom. So for Schiller, this emergent state achieves literally nothing. Nothing apart from the pleasure of being free from the necessity of the other two drives. As he writes, the aesthetic state is completely indifferent and unfruitful as regards knowledge or character. Beauty, especially, accomplishes no particular purpose, neither intellectual nor moral. So an argument can, of course, be made that the freedom from necessity entails a higher necessity insofar as the suspension of the sense and form drive is a necessary condition by which human nature is realized as essentially one of sheer potential. Indeed, as Schiller famously and sexistly put it, man, this is a quote, man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, and he is only fully a human being when he plays. So, but I'll leave that argument aside for now, right? One, because the idea of human nature is very unpopular these days. And two, it distracts me from the other point I want to make about the context in which Peirce deployed his concept of musement. So for now, it's sufficient to note that the play drive, as Schiller conceived it, is what inspired Peirce's notion of musement as a state that has no purpose unless recreation. So with that said, we can think musement's delightfully purposeless exercise of mind might suggest it's nothing but a trifle. However, in Peirce's account, it comes to play a very important role in his larger philosophical project, which frames thought as a naturally corrigible activity. Right? In other words, musement's lawless wondering makes it receptive to novelty and surprise, and as such serves as a basis for the way the mind freely generates and entertains ideas that can then develop into hypotheses and forms of knowledge. So musement's careless way of carrying on, therefore, has a way of being seized by the care of thought. And because thought, which according to Peirce is composed of signs that have a natural tendency to grow and to evolve, musement can look like the cradle of end-directed inquiry. Now, there's a little more to say about the context of the essay in which Peirce discusses musement. Notably, there's a very peculiar end he has in mind, and this end is the consideration of what he calls the neglected argument for the reality of God. So this argument, as the Peirce scholar Michael Raposa puts it, is that the muser will recognize on carefully considering the idea of God that it represents the summum bonum, the threefold aesthetic, ethical, and logical ideal that for Peirce constitutes the ultimate object of inquiry in the normative sciences. So the process goes like this. As a muser delights in the free play of ideas and noticing of wonders, Peirce suggests that the thought of origins and causes will inevitably arise and lead to a hypothesis about the ultimate source of things, right? So such a hypothesis will then stir, as he says, stir the muser to the depths of his nature by the beauty and idea and by its august practicality, even to the point of earnestly loving and adoring his strictly hypothetical God. So basically for Peirce, in Musement, a muser will be seduced by the aesthetic quality and usefulness of the God hypothesis, such that she will desire above all things to shape the whole conduct of life and all the springs of action into conformity with that hypothesis. Now, obviously, this idea is something that conforms with Peirce's what he calls pragmaticism, insofar as the inference or belief in a hypothesis, a belief in an ideal, has practical bearings on the muser's life. But the way that Peirce formulates his so-called neglected argument as naturally resulting from pure play and evident even to, as he says, a clodhopper, probably assumes too much. Right? So I'll deal with this and some other objections to Peirce's argument in just a moment. But first, I want to consider the more problematic issue that if such an effect of prolonged musement seems inevitable, then musement seems almost deterministic in its description. Right? Such a conclusion is completely at odds with Peirce's conceptualization of musement as a state that neutralizes the influence of specific traditions, authorities, or practical purposes. Right? So why then, if musement's purpose is to cast aside all serious purpose, does Peirce choose it as a method for developing or perhaps encouraging the so-called neglected argument? In one respect, the tension in the concept is just unavoidable. Peirce held the view that human reason, like organisms, evolves and therefore entails what he calls the growth of concrete reasonableness. Thinking is thus committed to a trajectory that sees it developing through processes of selection that solicit not just chance, but care and attention. Thus his famous saying, "It is not by dealing out cold justice to the circle of my ideas that I can make them grow, but by cherishing and tending them as I would the flowers in my garden." However, this teleological movement of thought seems, if I might meet Peirce's metaphor with one of my own, to cut musement off at the knees, forcing it to march on its speculative stumps towards an ever-receding horizon of rationality and order. Moreover, as Elizabeth Cook points out, for Peirce, all thought is in signs, and all signs are end-directed. So how then are we to make sense of a thought process which has no purpose? If we insist that musement is a form of thinking, and thinking is an ongoing semiotic process, a process of concatenated influences that become ever more and more well-defined, then we have to conclude that musement either isn't purposeless or it isn't a kind of thinking. So obviously this last bit is a reductio that puts pressure on Peirce's definition of musement by revealing the dialectical burden that its concept freights. If thought is that which becomes what it is, and as pointing beyond itself, then thought in and as musement, unless it is an absolutely reflexive activity, will always be drawn, addressed to, or pitched towards the expression of some kind of end that differs from itself. But this isn't really a problem for Peirce because his primary aim in the elaboration of the neglected argument is not to explicate musement, but to promote it as a veritable what I call supposition engine, a natural cognitive contrivance that exploits an instinctive human capacity for making good guesses about things. In other words, musement's dalliance with the stuff of thought lends itself to making up well-aimed explanations about the world, right? Hypotheses. However, this doesn't mean that musement forfeits its purposelessness. As a state of pure play, the deliverances of Musement become momentarily suspended, and the growth of signs temporarily adjourned. So for Peirce, what matters is that the spontaneity of thought is a given, right? But under certain circumstances, particularly, as he says, during walks at dawn or the gloaming, which is to say idle strolls during the crepuscular thresholds of the day, thought becomes more intense in its recreation, and thus more likely to chance upon a novel impression that only might or could lead the muser to consider such a novelty more closely. So, in Musement, Peirce sees a trajectory of sorts, one that entails a process of thought reasonably tending to produce a definite belief. And this makes a certain sense, right? It seems entirely reasonable to say that the musing mind will drift towards certain thoughts that it finds interesting and worth considering more carefully. It may even be inevitable that these interests get arguments formulated about them that serve as a basis to expand the muser's understanding. And it may come to pass that the muser is so enthralled with her notion, come argument, that she is stirred to her depths by its cleverness and beauty, and moved to shape the springs of action into conformity with the hypothesis. But that this process should lead spontaneously and inevitably to the idea of God's reality, and that a muser should be wholly smitten by such a conjecture is dubious at best. So now I'm going to just do a little bit, give a little bit of attention to addressing some of the objections to this neglected argument. So first of all, the very premise of Musement as subject only to the law of liberty is questionable. The God hypothesis, in other words, might very well just be a psychological vestige of the fact that we never muse in a vacuum, right? As Caleb Clanton suggests, it's improbable that we could ever jettison the influence of the various social, cultural, and religious milieus in which we are enmeshed. As such, other non-theistic and even non-religious hypotheses might well develop in the process of musement, depending on the social, cultural background in which a muser muses, right? So, quick digression. So a Buddhist might very well come to think about the idea of emptiness rather than God as hypothesis for first principles, for example. So secondly, even if musement does tend towards pondering first causes, it's not obvious to say that it will necessarily cleave to the hypothesis that posits God's reality. Right? I'm sure that many a muser has wondered why there is something rather than nothing, but has also never felt particularly moved by such a conceit. And even if one has entertained such a fancy, as Clanton notes, a muser who is drawn to the hypothesis of God's reality might remain perfectly agnostic about this hypothesis. Right? So there's nothing necessarily inevitable about its compellingness that Peirce thinks is the case. And finally, just because a concept is effective at shaping one's conduct doesn't make it true. In fact, the opposite might be more correct. As the German philosopher Hans Wegener, and your contemporary of Peirce's, tried to show with his philosophy of as if, a theoretical untruth or fiction is not practically valueless and useless. Wegener used the term fictionalism to describe how human thinking evolved from a tool for organizing sensations to become an end in itself, right? A reflexive mode of thought that traffics in ideals and nonsense, but which could nevertheless have great practical importance. So musement in this sense might be understood to promote an effective fiction rather than a reasonable or true line of inquiry. Right now, I could of course go on poking holes in Peirce's argument so that his skiff, which is what I've represented here, comes to look less like a boat and more like a sieve. But curiously, if it did, it wouldn't necessarily sink the ship, for in some cases, a sieve is as buoyant as a brick isn't. For instance, in Alfred Jarry's 1911 novel, The Exploits and Opinions of Dr. Fosterall, Pataphysician, the eponymous doctor, along with a hydrocephalic baboon and a bailiff, sail a sea-bound Paris in a 12-meter-long copper mesh skiff. This boat, which is also a bed that has been dipped in melted paraffin, floats due to the surface tension of water, according to Jerry's novel. So in this bed, which is also a boat and a sieve, is a vessel that transports not only Faustrel and his companions to various fantasy islands, but readers too of the novel into a wholly imaginary realm. Here, owing to the narrative's very sober articulation and analytical rigor, we as readers can lose track of the conventions that distinguish reality from whatever the opposite of reality is. Right, so the buoyancy of the sieve in this case literalizes the way Faustrel's story keeps itself afloat by its own leaky plot. And at the same time, it symbolizes the porous nature between fact and fiction. Okay, so returning to Peirce, we can see that this neglected argument, which purportedly arises instinctively from Musement, under scrutiny shows itself to be full of holes. Right? This argument is not watertight, in other words, if it's even an argument at all. But nevertheless, Peirce's point is that this argument, this skiff, bobs happily on the waters of belief, looking a lot like a floating sieve. That is, what Peirce is peddling with the notion of Musement is a way of thinking whose purposeless play is fain or delighted to make believe. In light of this, we might be more inclined to think of Musement as a form of, and this is to borrow from Jerry again, inutilious research, whereby the suppositions it yields are not so much hypotheses, but rather, as Jerry calls them, imaginary solutions. Solutions that are less replies to the Sphinx and more punchlines to a joke. So this means that Musement's play always comes as a surprise. And as a surprise, the play of Musement entails, to quote Kant, the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing. Now, that Peirce made something of this nothing, something of a useful but agreeable occupation of mind, makes Musement itself a type of imaginary solution. And his elaboration of it as a lawless play of thought that organically flowers into the contemplation of God makes of Musement something of what we might think of as a holy science, a science of distant castle building and questionable argument, or questionable arguments. Okay? But what then is the good of a holy science? As Brady Cranfield says of the neglected argument, the holes end up being through roads to pick up on the dead end of God that Peirce is attempting to secure. If so, then Musement is as good as a floating sieve, which is to say it's good for nothing, except maybe ending its own argument. But being good for nothing doesn't mean that nothing isn't good for something. Sartre, for example, argued that nothingness is the founding condition of consciousness whose mode of being is distinguished by not being that of which it is conscious. For Sartre, this nothing means that the being of consciousness is not determined and is thus condemned to a certain freedom. Similarly, if more modestly, when we consider the holes of Dr. Faustrel's sieve, we see also a nothing pointing to exactly where something isn't, pointing to exactly to where something that isn't that is good for something. So when I place my sieve on the river, says Dr. Faustrel, the water's skin tautens against the holes and the liquid flowing beneath cannot penetrate unless the skin breaks. So moreover, he says, continuing, if I should decide to expel my urates, or if a wave should break over the side, the liquid will simply pass through the mesh and rejoin the external waves. Right? So the nothing of holes in the sieve then are thus good for being, as well as for floating and filtering. But a holy science doesn't have to be either good or not good. It could simply be played more or less well. For instance, Musement doesn't entail error. This is largely because Musement, as a type of relaxed guessing game, doesn't have any goal apart from the agreeableness of its own diversion. Any guess, any kick at the ball is as good as another if it keeps the play, the dreaming, let's say, going on. And yet not every guess promotes the same style of play. Some guesses are simply time wasting, while others toy with the feeling that they need to explain something. What makes any style interesting or not depends on the way the guessing is passed off from one thought or one figurative foot to another. So strictly speaking, then, one can formulate an incorrect hypothesis, but not error in amusement per se. As Elizabeth Cook writes, there is no sense in which one can go wrong in amusement, amusement. For at the noticing stage of amusement, when one notices something strange, we cannot say that it is wrong to notice it or to find that it is surprising. In fact, as Cook continues, surprise itself is the discovery of an error in a previous belief or expectation. But the discovery of an error is not itself an error. It is rather an achievement, right? So we're surprised to halt amusement's play, then amusement really wouldn't play well. However, as an achievement, error plays exceptionally well, for error doesn't scuttle the game, but simply reverses its direction, sending thought on another tack. But there's something a little odd about the error-free nature of amusement. If amusement doesn't categorize thoughts into what's true or false, then it can't really distinguish what's important from what's trivial. And if the grave can't be sifted from the lively, the dead from the living, then what kind of sieve is amusement but an unholy one? Perhaps the greater issue then is not whether amusement is entirely free of error, but how its holes get plugged. So for Peirce, amusement floats because he seals the hole in his God hypothesis with the bung of vagueness and an appeal to his pragmatist theory of meaning, in which the meaning of the intellectual artifact, the God hypothesis in this case, and this is Peirce, lies in whatever unitary determination it would impart to practical conduct. That is, the belief in God floats because it has conceivable effects. Now, whether we take this as satisfying is perhaps something to be left for another discussion, but for now it might be sufficient to see the pragmatic theory of truth as yet another imaginary solution, a solution to the unholy science of amusement. Such a conclusion would lead then spontaneously and inevitably to a belief in Peirce as a pataphysician. And we can talk about what a pataphysician is afterwards if you're curious. What does all of this mean then? Well, if we take this talk as evidence of my own musing, which it is, then on the one hand, it shows amusement as a nugatory technique for thinking up arguments that really don't matter. Who cares if Peirce was a pataphysician? But on the other hand, if amusement really isn't about making truth claims, but rather claims regarding what is interesting, puzzling, and worth thinking about some more, then perhaps its value lies in the way it proposes other ways of relating to value. Now, Peirce's tendentious theory about this reality of God, or the belief in the reality of God notwithstanding, amusement's way of drinking in the impressions of some corner of the universe and wondering on them speaks of a technique for engaging with things apart from their assumed means and ends, right? So for me, this makes amusement an experimental practice, a way of probing the incipience of things and finding value in the very event of their becoming thought about. So thus, as an experiment, as an activity, the outcome of which is unknown, just to quote John Cage, amusement might teach the muser to consider not only what is worth thinking about some more, but what thinking itself is worth. And this now, perhaps more than ever, is a question that should be asked, given the way that capitalism has learned how to hijack our cognitive capacities, while, ironically, at the same time, our technologies are making it look like thinking is being done for us. So let's be clear, however, that I'm talking about a certain kind of thinking, right? The thinking that I have in mind is one whose value or worth is tied up in its not being valuable for what use it can be put to. What I mean by this is that value has to be rethought for a thinking that would, ironically, have none of it. Now, Brian Masumi's theory of value is helpful in this respect. In his 99 Theses for the Revaluation of Value, he argues that values, whose concept needs to be rescued from the application of norms and standards of judgment, must be uncoupled from quantification and recognized as he says, irreducibly qualitative. Now, Masumi writes, The dominant notion of value in our epoch is economic and relies on a consensus definition of money, which assumes that value is by nature quantifiable and posits money as the measure of value. This sense of value is, however, restricted insofar as it imagines that value is generated primarily by factors endogenous to an economic system, right, internal to it, such as cycles and crises arising as complexity effects of the market's very mode of operation. But as Musumi notes, fluctuations internal to the operations of the market fundamentally hinge on a certain privileged non-economic factor, a factor that he calls affect, right? So fear, doubt, insecurity, as well as hope and confidence, these are all examples of affect that are known to drive economic markets, but at the same time are in themselves disavowed as such. This is largely because affect is not an economic operator per se, but an exogenous qualitative fringe that agitates or modulates economic logic without belonging to it as such. What Musumi means then is that there's a connection between value and those subjective and vital factors pertaining to what we think of as qualities of life, or the singular color of an experience such as it is. So a life value has value, Musumi writes, to the exact degree to which it is incommensurable with any other experience. This is a way of saying that life value's value rests not in its exchangeability, but in the absolute specificity of its own signature way of carrying on. In other words, it's in the qualitative character of its own occurrence that an experience of thinking has value. In this respect, the kind of thinking that Musement stands for, which again Peirce characterizes as a purposeless but a lively, right, that's important, lively exercise of one's power, is a thinking whose worth lies just in the singular matter and manner of its being done for its own sake. But of course, not all thinking is worth its way of just in its way of just being done. For example, those who suffer from OCD would hardly concede that their thinking is worth the doing of it. For them, they're desperate for their obsessions not to be what they are. In fact, obsessions are exactly what Musement isn't, insofar as the former obsessions describe a species of recalcitrant thinking that urgently wants resolution, while the latter, thinking of Musement, is a thinking characterized by a sense of ease and a lack of needing anything to come of its carrying on. Musement's value as a lively exercise of one's power might be said then to stem from the way its ease of doing affirms a certain feeling of being alive, right? That is felt directly as thought, right? So this feeling of thinking, in this sense, is a feeling of vital factors expressed in and as a variety of ideas, whether these be good or bad, certain or dubious, probable or improbable. For Peirce, Musement always tends towards the better and more beautiful ideas, and thus his wholly misconstrual condemns Musement to meaning whatever comes of it. But an unholy Musement would see its thinking as entirely open to not only the beautiful, but the senseless and just plain weird. And it's this version of Musement that I think has a direct bearing on the notion of value. For thinking that has no purpose and thus recreation, as Peirce says, looks a lot like the kind of thinking that Jean Baudrillard imagined would emerge from the machinic uptake of thought. Now, and this is just how I will end in just the next couple of minutes, so hopefully you can bear with me. So writing in the twilight, or to use Peirce's word, the gloaming of the 20th century, Baudrillard posited that thought is not an operation, that it is not exchangeable for anything whatever, and so cannot be taken over by any machine. Thought, in other words, is not subject to the operational calculation of the input-output type. So this situation, this unexchangeability of thought, Baudrillard argues, makes thought horrified by itself in its incompleteness, and therefore all the more desperate to efface itself before its virtual equivalent. So thus, what we call artificial intelligence doesn't hold out the promise of thought as much as it prompts a radical re-evaluation of the purpose of thought. So a quote from Baudrillard again. It is all these optimum performance technical systems, writes Baudrillard, these systems of limitless performance of the world, which paradoxically, in absorbing all information, in concentrating all functions in themselves, clear the way for the exercise of a thinking freed from all purpose. Sounds familiar, right? All objectivity and restored to its radical uselessness. Now, if thinking can be hived off to machines, then it can become a spectacle, something to be mocked and placed in an indefinite state of suspense, where the act of thinking is indefinitely deferred. Thinking, so imagined, becomes exchangeable then for what we call intelligence, and thereby is rid of the burden of knowledge and information, of all the informational and communicational excess which encumbered it. So such a thinking is thus relieved of having any proper function. And if there is in our system a function which is in the process of becoming perfectly useless, thought must be that function. So for Baudrillard, thought then finds a new relationship to value, precisely where its appearance as intelligence, as calculation, as ratiocination is apparently taken over by machines. Hiving off a functional image of thought as one of ends and means to the likes of ChatGPT has then the precise and liberating effect of freeing up that which is not functional. So this is to say that the spectacle of thought figured by artificial intelligence is something of a boon for human beings insofar as the spectacle takes over the burden of knowing so that thought can once again assume its place where the thinking is, which is precisely in the play between the inorganic intellection of the machine and what I suggest is the organic dreaming of the human. So this play between opposing principles, human and human, organic, inorganic, intellection, dreaming, is what Baudrillard calls radical thought. And it's what I think comes closest to getting at how amusement revalues the value of thinking. Now, this is because radical thought refers to an order of thinking that lies at the violent crossing of sense and nonsense, truth and untruth, the continuity of the world and the continuity of nothingness. You could also say that radical thought inheres in the collision between two orders of thought represented by artificial intelligence and so-called real intelligence as the absolute point of contact between reality and illusion. Musement, similarly, is the absolute tendency for or point of contact where thought goes nowhere and everywhere, such that thinking might be free to circulate without passing through things like belief or doubt or even theory. Okay, so to end here, we'll just say what's really strange or ironic even is that radical thought and musement are nothing more than thought in its most literal form. For by relieving thought of its functionality and technical goals, from relieving it from the production of a fully reckonable or knowable world, we make room for thought in its ambiguous, its monstrous and secret forms that flicker freely in a singular openness to their practical nothingness. So said another way, musement and radical thought are like an extreme form of fashion, a form of ugliness so intolerable that we have to alter it not every 6 months, as Oscar Wilde said, but every waking moment. Musement and radical thought are the precession of nothing. Thus, the simulation of thinking that artificial intelligence is turns out to be very good for nothing. It's good for producing the kind of nothing that buoys a sieve, condemns us to freedom, or in the case of the unholy science of amusement, very good at dressing up emperors. So that's my gift. Did you want to keep recording or stop the recording? Okay. I'm going to stop my screen sharing. So.